Okay, that should be going now. Thank you all for being here. Okay, so I'm just going to do a brief introduction. Good afternoon and welcome to the session of the Contemporary Artist Book Conference titled Artist Book Criticism Beyond the Book. My name is Johanna Drucker. I am the librarian for the Fine Arts at New York University, and I'm joined today by Corina Reynolds, the executive director for the Center of Book Arts in New York. And as members of the organizing committee of the conference, we will act as your host for this session. The Contemporary Artist Book Conference has been held annually since 2008, and this year it is organized by the Center for Book Arts as part of the Printed Matter Virtual Art Book Fair. We'd like to thank the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts for their generous support of Center for Book Arts Criticism Initiative and in making the conference possible. Additional thanks to our conference sponsors, the Brooklyn Rail, Sorted Library, and Small Editions. Center for Book Arts and the usual in-person space of the Contemporary Artist Book Conference are on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging and uplifting the Munsee Lenape community, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations, and the lands in which you are tuning in from. There are 10 sessions overall between Friday and Sunday, exploring a wide range of questions about artist book criticism, what it is now, what it can and might be. A link to the CABC program will be posted in the chat window as well, so you can check out all the session details. These sessions include 2 convenings as part of the Book Art Review Initiative to help develop principles for the future of book art criticism, and a closing plenary in which we will look to collect actionable ideas and recommendations that arise throughout the conference. These items will be posted on the Center for Book Arts website with progress reported during the coming year and at next year's edition of the conference. In addition to the Zoom meeting, sessions will also be live streamed on the Center for Book Arts YouTube channel and will be recorded and posted after the conference. If you have questions during the session, please post them in the chat, and as hosts, we'll be asking them on your behalf to the panelists. Attendees will be muted throughout, and we'd recommend that you also keep your cameras turned off. Please feel free to chat during the session, and please remain respectful of the speakers and other attendees. We'll also be posting relevant links during the talks. If you need any assistance during the session, please send a private message to anyone with CABC in their name. So now I'd like to introduce the moderator of this session. Levi Sherman founded Artist Book Reviews in 2019 to promote criticism and appreciation of contemporary artist books. Before starting ABR, Levi wrote reviews for the Journal of Artist Books and Abecedarian Gallery. He is a member of the College Book Arts Association Theory and Criticism Subcommittee and the book review editor for Openings, Studies in Book Art. Levi also makes artist books of his own and holds an MFA in book and paper art from Columbia College, Chicago. His work is held in collections including the Joan Flash Artist Book Collection and the University of Arizona Poetry Center, and has been supported by grants from the College Book Arts Association, Awesome Foundation, and ACO Foundation. So Levi, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gianna. And thank you all for attending this discussion. I know the virtual format is a little bit different, but pulling this off is a huge achievement. So I'd like to begin by thanking the Center for Book Arts and Printed Matter for the remarkable work they've done this year. I'm really excited to be here with my fellow panelists, Erin Cohick, Johanna Drucker, and Megan N. Liberty. Not only are these 3 of the critics, scholars, and theorists that I most admire in our field, I think together the 4 of us are well positioned to discuss criticism beyond the book itself. The purpose of this panel is to better understand how criticism can address the context in which books are received and how these situations help or hinder criticism. This is especially important given the relative youth of our field and the reciprocal relationship among its theorists and practitioners. The fact that 3 of us also make books is evidence of just how close those relationships are. In other words, we have every reason to believe that criticism can actually influence what books are produced in the future, and certainly how they will be received. By addressing the institutions that entangle a book from inception and production to reception and survival, we can help the field grow with an understanding of the systems that shape it. Book arts is a field continually defining and redefining itself. That definition needs to not only reflect the field's diversity, but also help ensure equity by addressing the distribution of resources as a factor that shapes the field and therefore merits critical attention. So before I go on to my presentation, I'll go ahead and introduce everybody else, and then we'll just carry through in that order. So Erin Cohick is a printer, artist, and publisher based in Colorado Springs. His work focuses on the intersection of books, print, animation, and experimental text and image making. He is the founder and proprietor of New Lights Press and is also the printer of the press at Colorado College. Johanna Drucker is Distinguished Professor and Breslauer Professor in the Department of Information Studies at UCLA. She is internationally known for her work in the history of graphic design, typography, experimental poetry, fine art, and digital humanities. She is also known for her artist books, which were the subject of a traveling retrospective, Druckworks, 40 Years of Books and Projects, from 2012 to 2014. Megan N. Liberty writes about artist books, ephemera, archives, and other multidisciplinary meetings of text and image. She is the art books section editor at the Brooklyn Rail and co-founder of Book Art Review. Her writing appears regularly on Hyperallergic and in Art Review, and has also been published in Artforum.com, Art in America, Frieze, New York Review of Books Daily, and elsewhere. So those of us engaged in book art criticism can agree on a few things. It's difficult, time-consuming, and doesn't pay well. So I began my project, Artist Book Reviews, the way I begin any major project, by trying to talk myself out of it. And if you're looking for an argument against artist book criticism, Ulysses Carrion is a good place to start. Of course, since I'm presenting here, you will have guessed that I ultimately won this imaginary debate. But Carrion's 1980 essay, Bookworks Revisited, remains a valuable barometer. So my presentation today will begin with his most explicit criticism of the, quote, misunderstanding that books would allow artists to liberate themselves from galleries and art critics. He continues, I would like to ask, what for? To fall into the hands of publishers and book critics? Let's imagine a world without artworks, a utopian society where books are the only known possibility for a creator to embody his mental and emotional world. Now imagine that the creators of this world discover the field of visual arts. We can imagine their enthusiasm as they think, no more literary critics, no more intermediaries between our works and the audience, no more prestigious publishing houses, no more translations, no more bestseller lists, no more handwritten originals, etc. For Carrion, artist books were trapped between two unsavory options, art criticism and literary criticism. Today, I would argue the situation is even worse. Rather than choosing between two systems of intermediaries, artist books are squashed beneath the combined weight of both. For example, an artist book may pass through a publisher's editor, a gallery's curator, and a journal's critic before reaching a potential reader. More likely still is that the critic's review catches the eye of a dealer who then places the book in a collection where a reader may encounter it through the added mediation of cataloging or yet another exhibition. There are important differences between criticism and these other forms of gatekeeping, but they are all forms of mediation between the work and the audience. So if we accept Carrion's position that mediation is bad, we must ask, why do criticism at all? In answering this question for artist book reviews, I've formulated what I think of as a weak argument and a strong argument. Before I walk you through these arguments, I should say that my victory over Carrion was not only imaginary, but also pyrrhic. In responding to Carrion's concerns, I have raised a number of even more challenging questions that look beyond the artist-reader binary at the full range of players in the field. These broader questions are ultimately the reason for this panel and are reflected in the range of participants. But for now, let me present what I think of as the weak defense of criticism. Here, we can accept a binary caricature of Carrion's choice between art critics and literary critics and simply choose the lesser of evils. For artist book reviews, this means leaning towards literary criticism in the sense that the critic operates more like a newspaper book reviewer or a book blogger than a conventional art critic. An artist or publisher sends us a copy of the work to be reviewed, and the reviews tend to focus on the form and content of the book as a self-contained expression, with the understanding that this is closer to the way another reader might encounter the book. We don't ignore context, for example, other works by an artist or other books in the same series by a publisher, but as critics, we get to define the scope of that context rather than reviewing a piece within the context established by a curator. Context is, after all, infinite, so it matters a great deal how it is defined. The weak argument is essentially, Why not review books the way the readers read them? That fit between the reader's reading experience and the reviewer's reading experience is a matter of what Carrion called specific conditions for reading. He wrote, "There must be a coherence between the possible potential messages of the work, its visible appearance, and the manner of reading that these two elements impose or suggest or tolerate. With artist book reviews, I hope to convey the manner of reading that the book suggests rather than what an exhibition or some other framework imposes." The logistics and economics of book buying also impose upon the reader's experience. And in this regard, artist book reviews also tries to align more closely with its readers. For example, we receive the books by mail and keep the copies. This no doubt influences what books we receive, but in doing so, ensures that a reader who decides to purchase their own copy of a book will have a similar experience. This highly practical consideration speaks to a deeper ontological issue. Carrion wrote, "If we consider the objectual production of works of art in book format, one copy of the book is not the book is the whole edition." Receiving and owning a copy of a book allows a critic to review the book's capacity to insinuate itself into various situations. Intimacy and portability are key features of the medium. An analogy might be the difference between a theater critic who reviews a play, a single contingent instantiation of the work, versus a literary critic who reviews the playwright's script. I also hope that this analogy shows that there are real advantages to both approaches and that I'm not at all opposed to exhibition-based criticism or other formats. So this weak argument, an alignment between the reader and reviewer, is necessary, at least for now, because Carrion's alternative hasn't panned out. The idea that bookstores and libraries can provide readers with unmediated access to artist books was flawed even in 1980, when Carrion curiously ignored the gatekeeping role of bookstore proprietors like himself. But 4 decades later, the situation is less tenable still. Zine fests and art book fairs are a thrilling way to survey the field, to network, and yes, to buy tote bags full of books. Likewise, online shopping makes it easy to acquire books from faraway places. But neither of these situations allow for the intimate, contemplative experience of the bookstore. In this absence, critics offer potential readers a better sense of a book's content and quality. This leads to the strong defensive criticism, which may be harder to live up to, but is easy enough to articulate. Critics can encourage artists to remain ambitious and avoid pitfalls. It was 1980 when Carrion wrote, "We are no longer innocent. Now it isn't enough to be an artist in order to produce bookworks. Now it isn't enough to produce books in order to affirm that they are bookworks." Surely the sentiment is doubly true today, but I think it's fair to say that some artists are still producing books to affirm that they are books. In fact, the growing popularity of the medium may be driving this perpetual rediscovery. Criticism and scholarship can help practitioners find more productive avenues in 3 ways. 1, informing artists of what has already been done. 2, incentivizing artists by celebrating ambitious, innovative works. And 3, perhaps when all else fails, constructively criticizing works that fall short of advancing an important artistic argument. I hope that these 2 defenses demonstrate that there is a role for criticism without diminishing the gravity of Carrion's concerns. Especially for those of us who are also practitioners, it can be uncomfortable to get between an artist and their audience. Perhaps we should borrow from medicine the principle first do no harm. I would like to think that artist book reviews is a force for good, but its shortcomings are undeniable. Aligning the reviewer with the reader, even if there were only one monolithic reader, can scarcely address a field that also includes artists, publishers, curators, dealers, retailers, book fairs, collectors, scholars, and appreciators. Add to this the role of institutions, libraries, galleries, museums, universities, residencies, studios, and so on, and the ability for the critic to set the boundaries of context looks less like freedom and more like an impossible test. By letting the book suggest the manner in which it is read, it is easy to erase the role of institutions, capital, and labor in the production and reception of the book. But these factors impose and tolerate their own conditions. For artist book reviews, the solution has been beyond criticism, strictly speaking. Rather than expand each review into the full context of the communication circuit, I've added interviews with practitioners to the platform. My initial worries that interviews weren't as rigorous as reviews were quickly allayed by the realization that artists are quite willing to discuss how space, time, and money shape the books they produce. For me, the benefits of this deeper dialogue outweighed the loss of critical distance, especially since the reviews and interviews remain separate. No, these conversations aren't criticism. After all, what an artist manages to do with the means at their disposal is still open to evaluation. But such conversations are necessary for the field as a whole, a field that seems to be entering its awkward adolescent phase at a time when issues around access and equity finally have traction. Doing no harm means addressing the way that resources and opportunities are allocated among the practitioners and other players in the book arts. Artist Book Reviews has been a great vehicle for discovering problems with criticism, if not solving them. Fortunately, I'm joined here by 3 interlocutors whose varied approaches make me hopeful that this interdisciplinary field will find a way forward. And to that end, I'm pleased to hand things over to Aaron Cohick with a quick note to look out for in the chat for those of you on this Zoom. I'll be adding some links throughout the presentation, and I will also put in contact information and links to artist book reviews for those of you interested. Thank you, and take it away, Aaron.
Thank you, Levi. Thank you to Printed Matter and Center for Book Arts and for putting all this together. Thank you to Johanna and Megan and Levi for inviting me to be on this panel. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here, and thank you all for being here and listening. I'm going to share my screen and jump right in here. Okay, so I was asked to be on this panel to talk about a very specific thing, the Book Art Theory blog published by the College Book Art Association. My plan is to quickly introduce the College Book Art Association and then talk about the blog, how it works, some specific posts that show its potential, and how it might point to more possibilities in creating an ecosystem of criticism and theory in and around artist publications. And of course, how you can get involved. As Levi already mentioned, he'll be posting some relevant links in the chat. Thank you for doing that, Levi. So to start with the College Book Art Association, or CBAA for short, and full disclosure, I am on the CBAA board of directors, so I am totally going to make a pitch for the organization here. CBAA is a nonprofit membership organization focused on book arts and the teaching of book arts. As the name implies, it started as an academic association, but has expanded to include book arts teaching and learning in all of its forms and sites. The members are educators, students, artists, scholars, librarians, critics, designers, etc., really anyone interested in artist books. I think of it as a large mutual aid group and a mechanism for the redistribution of resources. Members pool money, time, energy, and expertise to give grants, awards, and scholarships, to organize exhibitions, conferences, and other events, and to create resources for use by the field. And one last and very important note to end my pitch for CBAA: membership is free for students, and for everyone else, it is on a pay what you want scale, starting at $0. So if it sounds at all interesting, I definitely encourage you to join and to pay what seems reasonable to you. So the Book Art Theory blog is one of the many things that CBAA does. The blog itself has a main editor, Susan Vigors, and then a group of moderators that solicit and write posts. The moderators are made up of volunteers from the membership. I've been a moderator and writer for several years. The blog has published a post on the 1st and 15th of every month since October of 2015. It missed once on September 1st, 2019. And I just want to take a moment to publicly acknowledge and thank Susan Vigors for all of her work in making that happen for the past 5+ years. Thank you, Susan. It's incredible to look back now and see the accumulation of all those years of work. And it keeps going. So the blog itself is just that, nothing fancy, just a blog using a setup from circa 2002. It's mostly text, some images, some hyperlinks. It has an editorial statement that is purposefully wide. Quote, capitalizing on the interdisciplinary nature of the field, this blog calls attention to criticism and theory about the book as a medium and/or subject in works of art, and more generally about book art. It seeks to encourage dialogue, solicit comments, and create a generative space for new ideas from critics and theorists of various fields regarding the aesthetic, semiotic, haptic, cognitive, historical, and other features that distinguish these works and their function in ethical, political, and social matters, end quote. And for me, the most interesting part of that statement is the end. It explicitly mentions the function of art and then how that connects to, quote, the ethical, political, and social matters, which is an acknowledgement that art is inseparable from all of those considerations, which Levi was talking about as well. Working on books and publications tends to foreground those aspects, and I appreciate that the editorial statement makes space for them. And I'll admit that it seems strange to be talking about a blog in 2021. But what excites me about this blog and the blog format in general is that openness, the generative space that is mentioned in the editorial statement. The book art theory blog is purposefully informal and open to experimentation. Some posts are journalistic, while others are more like thoughtful personal journal entries. There is some theory, of course, and some reviews with plenty of experimentation with text and image. Some of my favorite posts have been responding to The New Art of Making Books by India Johnson and Andrea Bell Urruti, a post that talks about Ulysses Carrion's classic manifesto, The New Art of Making Books, in terms of sculpture and process, and then links to a Google Doc of a new translation of the Carrion text and a whole new piece, The Old Art of Making Books. Then there's We're All Water by Marianne Dagis and Where All Water Continued by Leah Mackin, which are linked posts on writing process, technology, and the work of Madeline Gins and Kamal Braithwaite. There's The Case for Memes by Beth Sheehan about book arts memes and how they might be used in critique. Making Books by Hand, Struggle and Grace by Emily Larned, which is a post about process, repetition, and making an edition. Two recent posts by Alexander Mouton, Extending Literature Through the Artist Book and Nonlinearity and the Hyperlink on artist/photo books as a kind of literature. H.R. Beechler's intricate series of posts called On the Threshold, Entertaining Specificity, that tangle and untangle the frames, forms, and formats of books and publications. And Compulsory End-of-Year Navel Gazing by Andrea Kohashi on sorting out a postgraduate identity and artistic practice. And of course, that list is by no means exhaustive. There are so many really great posts. And I think that this blog and the many others that we should all start, plus newsletters, websites, etc., can become a kind of foundational seed layer for new writing and thinking about the field. These can be very general, on-focus things like the CBAA blog, and there can be projects that are more specific, like a blog or newsletter about photo books or about activist publications. The general point being to have a healthy, diverse, wild, and informal space that is also public, a space where ideas can be cultivated, tested, and shared, a space that can be built from the bottom up. Going back to that first post I showed by India Johnson and Andrea Bell Urruti with that link to the Google Doc, that is a really simple, elegant way to make the text accessible, and it's a first round of publishing that could eventually become a book or another project or publication. I find the ordinariness and effectiveness of the Google Doc and this table containing the text to be really compelling somehow. There is an aesthetic and maybe even a materiality there inseparable from the accessibility. It's a kind of digital immediacy. And back to the blog forum, it's not platform specific, so all of that work is not captured, monetized, and algorithmed to death by social media companies. I love the way that Levi publishes with Artist Books Reviews. It uses social media, but isn't limited by it. As makers and critics of books and book-like things, we can and should be very aware and careful about form and platform, about who benefits and who is excluded. I really believe that this community is particularly well equipped to build an inclusive, dynamic, and sustainable ecosystem for artists, books, and artist books criticism. It's clearly already started, right? That's what we're all doing here. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what the future holds and what we can all build together. And hey, if you don't want to start your own blog or newsletter yet, but you have some ideas that you need to write about, the College Book Art Association Book Art Theory blog accepts submissions. You do not have to be a member, but you could be. So if you have something you want to write about, just email the editor, Susan Figures, at blog@collegebooKart.org and let her know what you're thinking about. Thank you.
I think I'm next, right, Levi?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, Levi, for inviting me to be on this panel, and to my fellow panelists. It's really great to be here. When I got into artist books so many years ago, I had no idea there was a community like this waiting, and to see over 100 people here tuning in is pretty amazing. I'm sure we all wish we could be in person, but there's something really special about being able to reach a global audience like this. That's very exciting. As Levi noted in my intro, I have a few roles within the art book world, but today I will primarily be speaking about my role as the art book section editor at the Brooklyn Rail. The field of art books and artist book criticism, a field I would argue, and many of us here have set up, it's emerging but rapidly growing. It's shaped and influenced by a number of institutions, many of which have already been noted by my fellow speakers today, and as many other fields of criticism are also shaped by many institutions. But the book is perhaps more vulnerable or even susceptible to the influence of these institutions because of its hybrid nature and how easily it can fall prey to the conventions of existing models of criticism, primarily visual arts and the traditions of art historical criticism, and literature and the traditions of literary or poetry criticism. Both fields offer much to the critical approaches we use to book art, but book works are also like sculptures, and they're temporal like film and performance, adding further genres of criticism and study to the mix here. I'd like to pause to make a quick note on terminology here. I have so far used 4 different terms purposefully: art book, artist book, book art, and bookwork, to indicate the way that terminology is perhaps the first framing institution that we have to deal with. These terms are set by librarians, archivists, curators, art historians, and writers, and each represent their own institutional backgrounds and approaches to the field. Each of us here in attendance at this talk have specific ideas in mind when I say each of these terms, and likely we don't all agree. In my opinion, this is exciting and shows the potential, diversity, and mobility of this genre that is still evolving today. But for critical purposes, it does muddy the starting point of writing about a work when we first must all agree on whether it even fits into this genre. This is a topic for another panel, and in fact, there is going to be a panel later this afternoon on terminology that I encourage you all to attend. But for now, I just wanted to mention this before talking about the institutions I myself am involved with. Going forward, I prefer the term bookwork because of its emphasis on work, but because of today's theme, taking the temperature of artist book criticism, I'm going to continue to use that term. So, what institutions frame my approach to artist book criticism? As an editor at the Rail, I represent the institution of the magazine or the newspaper, which has a different approach to criticism than, say, academic scholars. My interest is in a kind of criticism that uses plain language and is largely readable to the average reader of cultural criticism more broadly. Also, my background is in both the literary and visual arts. I have a master's in art history, so I'm trained in writing about art through the discipline of art history. But also my bachelor's is in English Lit. So really I came to writing about art after first writing about texts. And I say text to reference Ulysses Carrion and his notion of books versus the text inside them, to distinguish between the kind of writing we're talking about here today, which does consider the whole object of the book, versus the kind of writing I was taught in undergrad that focused just on the contents within. So as the editor of a section titled Art Books, not bookworks, artist books, or book art, it does cover more than just the types of books we're here to talk about today. I've been the editor of the section since 2018 and began writing for the Brooklyn Rail, specifically the art book section, in 2015. I was super excited to see that a section like this even existed and immediately just dove right into writing for it. When I took over as editor, there weren't clearly written out or stated guidelines for what we as an institution considered an art book. So my first task was to sort of develop these institutional guidelines that I could share with writers. And as much as I resist putting a box around these terms, as an editor, it is necessary for building and growing a body of criticism that is not yet fully defined. So I'm going to try to drop this link in the chat for all of you to the Google Doc I share with writers who are interested in contributing to the art book section, to give them a sense of what I'm looking for in the section and what I'm looking less for. Some of the broad categories of books we review in the section include collections of criticism, artists writing in sketchbooks, and other sorts of published ephemera or archival materials. Artist books, including self-published books, books by small presses, and more widely distributed, larger trade edition style artist-produced or designed books. My other two guidelines, which I will come back to, are that the book must be recent, as in published within the last 6 months of when we will publish the review. And it must be accessible to Rail readers. Usually this means that it's available in a bookstore or on view in an exhibition, but it can also mean that it is easily requested at a public library. A quick note, I was really interested in Levi's talk of his idea of these places as gatekeepers. And that's something that I hope we come back to in the Q&A, thinking about the role that how people access these books comes into play. So I'll come back to those specific two guidelines later, because I know they do create the most limitations on my section and what we can cover. As for what we usually don't cover, I developed this list by asking myself some questions, primarily, why does this have to be a book? And what does this content or substance offer to us in book form that it would not in another form? And does it need promotion in a section devoted to materials that already get less coverage? Since, as part of what we're talking about today, we know that art books and artist books in particular are not widely reviewed as other arts. So that means we don't usually review in the art book section of the Brooklyn Rail, we don't usually review exhibition catalogs unless the catalog does something interesting or specific that the experience of going to the exhibition itself doesn't offer. I find that usually, not always, of course, when people review exhibition catalogs, they really just want to review the exhibition. We also don't cover big survey coffee table books as much that are very broad and more general focused, like a big book on women designers or even a big coffee table book on artist books, because it wouldn't offer the depth required to really get into the meat and bones of the content and to offer that kind of critical experience. Finally, we also don't really review monographs and biographies of established artists. With this, I really come back to why a book? Why does it need to be promoted in this space that's devoted to art books? And books published, my section only publishes 4 print reviews and 1 web review each issue. So it's really thinking about how that space can be best used to serve, I hate to use the word promote, but also to promote and give critical space to something that would not get the space elsewhere. And popular monographs and biographies of already established artists are likely to get this coverage elsewhere. And while biographies are important, I do make an effort to cover artists who have been less frequently talked about. So we do cover biographies of artists who are underrepresented, haven't had as much critical attention paid to their work, and I do feel like that's important, as well as biographies that make use of unpublished materials and allow the reader to have that experience reading the archival materials as well. As I said, many of these titles don't necessarily fit within the specific realm of artist books, but this gives you a sense of the larger context of the editorial section that I'm dealing with. Now, to get back to the guidelines I mentioned earlier about timing and access, regarding the 6-month window guideline, what I'm hoping to do with that is create a sort of event or a buzz around the books and their release, much like we feel around an exhibition opening and much the way that exhibitions are only reviewed primarily when they're open or shortly after they close. I try to use that same logic for art books. As for the guidelines about accessing the book and thinking about the role of gatekeeping institutions that Levi mentioned, I think what makes books as art exciting is the immediacy, that anyone can have an immediate and intimate experience with a work of art. It feels important to me that if we are devoting space to something, that people can see it, that people can access it. But I do know that these two guidelines are also limiting. Some publishers are not able to send out advanced review copies or have their materials publicized in a timeline that allows for the review to come out within 6 months. Likewise, books produced in small editions often can't be sent as review copies at all. I'm certainly aware of these problems, and one of the questions I pose to all of you, and then I hope that something that comes out of this conference and this session are ways of solving these problems and thinking about ways to better get these books into the hands of critical readers and critical writers, and in doing so, expand and grow the field of artist book criticism. Thanks.
Okay, I have to say I want to stand up and cheer. That was wonderful, Megan. And, you know, many thoughts here that I would love to, you know, sort of celebrate. And also in Aaron and Levi's talks. But Megan, I have to say I appreciate the succinctness and clarity with which you state many things that I have great sympathy for. And I think the whole idea of why is it a book? And why does it need to be in this medium is probably the crux of the critical issue. And I would amend that slightly by saying, or extend it, not so much amend it, by one of the pieces of my mantra, which is how. How is it a book? And how does the medium function? So I'll come back to that at the end, but you know, just terrific, and terrific to see all of this energy actually on all of your parts. I said I would come at the end to give sort of a long view here of criticism in the field of artist books. And as most of you know, it's a long view. I made my first book almost 50 years ago. So, you know, we don't even want to go there, right? But the point is that what's interesting is that in the mid-1970s, I was working in the context of a literary print shop in the Bay Area. It was around 1976. And Joan Hugo and Judith Hofberg, names that should be known to some of the people here, but not perhaps all, came to the West Coast Print Center, and they were from Southern California, art librarians and people involved in artist book activity. And they came to the West Coast Print Center and they were looking for artist books. They said, well, here's this print center that's funded by the NEA and what is it doing? And they came in and they were looking around. They said, where are the artist books? Where are the artist books? And I remember meeting them, and at the time I had several books I had printed that, you know, printed and published myself that I began to show them, and they were like, oh, but before that it was literary small press publishing. There really weren't artist books. We weren't doing artist books. It wasn't the mission of the institution, but it also is striking to me that in 1976, when they were asking that question, almost nobody in that institution could answer them because they didn't know what was being looked for. It's like, what are you talking about? You mean something with pictures in it? You mean a photographic book? Now, we were publishing things that were part of the conceptual photo book world, but not so very, very much. But anyway, I mention this because, again, you know, I'm less and less interested over time in the question of classification. I don't care about, is it an artist book or not an artist book? What I'm interested in is, how is it a work that uses the book in some way? And that can be very minimal or it can be very maximal, but how is it a work that uses the book and could not be anything but a book, and therefore is contributing something to the discourse of contemporary culture, a critical issue, an ethical issue, a personal issue? And one of the great things about artist books is, in some ways, they've been a very unregulated space, right? That it's like, you can make a book, right? It's, you know, you make a painting. But the question of how we use criticism in relationship to this widespread practice, I think comes down to two core issues for me. The first one is, there's so much stuff. There's just so much stuff. So one of the roles of a critic is to say, look at this, because this is interesting and worth your time. And, you know, so we rely on critics to survey a much broader field than they report on. And I think of this in relationship to curators as well. When I think about my fantastic colleagues, Robert Gore in the Art Library, Russell Johnson down in Health Sciences, Jeannie Garrard, I mean, the people I work with, they look at so much material and then they say, okay, this is worth keeping, this is worth preserving, this is worth showing to students, this is worth showing to researchers. So the first role of the critic is to help us, you know, sort of focus on things that are of interest. And again, not to the exclusion of other materials, but just because there's so much stuff, right? So, and you don't have to agree with them. I often disagree with the choices that, you know, my friends and colleagues make, but that's not the point. The point is that the first job of the critic is to say, this is worth your time. And I think the second job of the critic, and all of you have already touched on this, is to give viewer readers an insight into how to have the experience that the work provides. Now, some works are more self-evident than others, but other works we know benefit from that critical opening up, for having someone standing next to you. I mean, how many exhibits have I been in where, you know, Susan B is saying to me, oh no, you know, look at that, this is good, I'll tell you, this is good. And it's like, and I'm thinking, really? And then, you know, little by little, I get shown why it's interesting. Okay, so those are the two functions I want from criticism. Call something to attention and show me why. Show me why and how it's of interest. So if I go back then to my own engagement with criticism in this field, again, I'm a practitioner, I make books, I've made books again for many, many decades. The first understanding I had of critical intervention in the field was when Joan Lyons was putting together the critical anthology and source book. And at the time, my colleagues and mentors, Betsy Davids and James Petrillo, were writing an article for that particular anthology. There are still, in that 1985 anthology, articles that cannot be surpassed. They are as useful now as they were at that time. And, but they were written from within fairly circumscribed understandings of the field. There wasn't at that point what I would call a metacriticism. There wasn't a sense that there was a kind of set of principles against which we could reference the kind of investigations that form the articles in that work. So they were kind of reports in depth, but from what almost without a frame. It's called the Critical Anthology and Source Book, and the editor was Joan Lyons. Okay, so fast forward, and we get to the mid-90s, and the time I was married to Brad Freeman and working with Steve Clay. And we were, you know, we knew Clive Philpott. We were having all kinds of discussions about artist books. I mean, we knew everybody around who was doing artist books, of course. And the question was, why isn't there a better critical, more robust critical discussion in this field. Why hasn't that happened? Since Joan Lyons's publication, there really hadn't been very much in terms of critical writing. There were wonderful catalogs, short essay pieces and stuff, Germano Salant's work. I could cite a whole bunch of things. And so I decided that, okay, there's a backstory I can tell if somebody wants, but we decided to do a book called The Century of Artist Books. And I say we because though I wrote the book, I couldn't have written that book if Tony Zwicker, Steve Clay, and especially Brad Freeman hadn't been involved in helping me understand how to look at books and how to think about them. I take responsibility for all the crimes in that book, and so forth. But that was a systematic attempt to lay out a critical framework for looking at the field. And it does that. And it did it in 1994. And it also happened at the same time that Brad decided to found the Journal of Artist Books, which for 25 years, as you know well, Levi, for 25 years was the sole publication to really focus on artist books, right? There was Ampersand and there were a few other things. After The Century of Artist Books was published, I tried to get several mainstream journals interested in letting me write about artist books on a regular basis. And it just, nobody wanted it because again, they seem like, well, they're not that important. They're not regular. It's like, where do they fit? And what's been interesting to me is to watch how video came to have a place in the art world when artist books did not, and they kind of started from the same place. So in 2004, then, the next project I was involved with, because Journal of Artist Books, continued, and I would always write for it when Brad had empty space, and he'd say, I need a couple columns, to fill out the journal. I'd say, okay. And I went on to do other things, including work on Ilya Stanevich, the biography of whom I have just published. And it's, again, a study of a particular formation of book art and engagement with the book as a modern form. But in 2004, in the context of digital humanities at the University of Virginia, I created a project and platform called Artist Books Online. And the critical aspect of that project, again, conceived 10 years after The Century of Artist Books, was to try to use metadata in a way that would call attention to the features of books that go back to this question, why a book and how a book? So if you know anything about the history of metadata, cataloging, descriptive cataloging really comes out of the, there's a whole world of just, straight up bibliographical description, but then, for rare books, for, sort of works that have a detailed provenance or some kind of specialized character or quality, there's augmentation that goes on. But the specialized vocabulary that we developed for Artist Books Online, and here Dora Boehm was involved with this project, as well as Joan Lyons, as well as Clifton Metter, Phil Zimmerman, a bunch of people who were, sitting in different roles within this community, artists, book artists, curators, librarians, and so forth. The idea was, could we come up with a set of terms that weren't part of the Library of Congress or the, Getty vocabularies, but that said, show us how the book works. And this goes back to this concept of work. Show us how the book works. How is it a work? What is the work that it does? And so things like sequence and development and so forth were properties of the book that we thought should be called to attention. The upshot of this was, of course, we did I did do that platform. It still exists, sort of mothballed, but was a lot of pushback. And in particular, I won't say from whom, I can dish that for if you want, but pushback from various members of the pedagogical, as it were, community who said, this is too hard. I can't think this hard. This is too, why don't you just show the books? So, I have no patience with that kind of garbage. As far as I'm concerned, that's just intellectual laziness. So anyway, so I went on to do that project. And again, it's there and it's used. In kind of pulling this to a close then, if I were to say, what are the things that seem really compelling to me about the intellectual challenge of writing about artist books. It's that on the one hand, we do have this kind of free range space. Like I go into the printed matter book fair when it's even in a virtual space, you know, there's so much stuff being produced and stuff from every direction, from all kinds of communities and at all levels of production values. And I think this is great. This is right. This is a good idea. However, the process through which some of that material comes to be valued and called to attention, and then also collected, maintained for future work, that's more complicated. And again, unfortunately, I still see a lot of work collected that's collected simply on the basis of production values and not on the basis of conception values or social values, right? So to me, again, when I look at a work, I want to think about what is the work it does. And that concept of work kind of goes to what Aaron was talking about, I think, in some of his final slides, that work, you know, is aesthetic work. What is aesthetic work? Why is it different from other kinds of work? It's different because aesthetics is the domain in which we call things to attention through material, formal, and performative expression. And understanding those performative dimensions of a work of art so that it has some purchase, it has some impact, it has some engagement with the world around us is the thing that I feel most interested in developing a critical language for. Because that seems to me to go right back to where I started, and I'll come to an end then, which is not just to ask, you know, why is it a book, but how in being a book does it do the work that it does? And that work is not just formal work, though formal work is important, I believe, in, you know, sort of understanding the formal features of an aesthetic work, but the work is social. It's cultural. It's, you know, engaged with providing some kind of insight into what it is to have the experience of being a human being, right? We make art to have space to call attention to what it is to have experience. And in a world of overflowing, you know, monoculture, polyculture, and so forth, carving out that space, giving the pause, looking at something is so powerful. And I'll finish just by saying that, for instance, last night I did one of my book clinics at the Center for Book Arts, and there were all kinds of wonderful projects that people brought. But one of them, and I hope I'm not embarrassing this person by calling her out, but this wonderful book by a woman named Amanda Sauer, who had a series of photographs documenting over time the attack of an ash tree by a particular invasive beetle species. And the quietness of it and the profundity and the tragedy of it were absolutely beautifully presented in this book format so that you had the temporal unfolding of what is not just a single tragedy, but an index to a much greater set of concerns with which we all are engaged. So let's think about a work like that, and it's like, wow, you know, there it is. That one work, that book work, made that space to call something to attention through its means and its working and its performative dimensions. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. While we're waiting for any questions to come in from the chat, I wonder if we could just, I kind of wanted to follow up on this idea. You know, you mentioned the question of how do we develop a critical language? And it, you know, it strikes me that Megan talked about coming from, you know, an English background originally where you learn to write about the text rather than the book. I have, you know, a BFA and an MFA, so I would say, like, you know, I learned studio critique rather than criticism. And I think what Aaron talked about, this idea of the blog as a generative kind of open space for people to try different approaches, maybe that's, you know, one answer certainly, or the answer to how to develop a critical language. But I'm wondering if the three of you could, reflect on how do we develop more critics, or how do we at the very least introduce that critical language to more people, even if they don't want to practice criticism, as a way of learning how to look and appreciate.
Well, I'll just say one thing, Levi, and that is that I would say within the context of the programs where people are teaching artist books, that it would be very helpful to have, a course on how to write about artist books. I mean, certainly if you're in an MFA program of any kind, you're usually involved in workshop activity where you're learning how to talk about your colleagues' work. You have to write artist statements that are, that really articulate a point of view. And I think certainly if you're in art history or literary work, you have to, constantly be honing those critical skills. But artist books haven't had that kind of disciplinary center for critical work. And so I think that's a possibility. I hate formulas, and I hate rules, and I hate orthodoxy. And so the question is, also, how do we keep from prescribing, and proscribing what things should be? Because, what criticism should be.
Yeah, I think just piggybacking off of that, it's so interesting that you, Johanna, just said how much you hate prescribing rules. And I also feel that as well. I mentioned in my presentation, having to say what is and isn't an artist book is or an art book, or any of these categories, is such a conversation I'm not interested in having. But at the same time, we have to give writers the language to help them define these objects as something that is more than a literary book and different than a purely visual object. And so that's kind of where I wonder, at least for me, coming from, as I said, a mixed background in both visual and verbal arts, it's almost like I had to unlearn certain trainings from both disciplines in order to be able to write about artist books. On the one hand, this idea of a purely visual object is very useful in thinking about the artist book as something we see and experience and what its visual properties are. On the other hand, the tools I learned in my literary practice as an English Lit student, thinking about being able to draw out specific points of text and spend a very long time on small analysis of small aspects was very useful. But then in both disciplines, they sort of negate each other when we have to consider all these things in an object that's both durational and tactile and sculptural, as well as something seen and read.
Yeah, but Megan, you just said it. And
Yeah.
it's like, that set of principles is not impossible for people to engage with. And again, this is where, again, what's part of the function of criticism is that it enhances your appreciation of and enhances your experience. So, I think, that set of features that you just called out, again, it's like that, in keeping those terms really engaged in the conversation, I think is useful. But again, I can remember some years ago when we first started doing pretty aggressive criticism. It was the jab period of jab in the Journal of Artist Books. And, we got all kinds of, slammed for it this way and that way. And I think I wrote a piece, I can't remember most of the things I write, but I wrote a piece, I think, that was called something like Beyond Velveeta. And it's like, you may not have grown up with Velveeta. I hope for your sake you did not. But, we grew up on Velveeta, which was a cheese product. And at a certain point in no animals were harmed, believe me. And, at a certain point, you begin to be exposed to things that expand your appreciation of what cheese might be, right? And yeah, sure, it smells like gym socks, but boy, it tastes so great. And, so you begin to have a greater appreciation. So, it's like, again, the point of criticism is I I think it increases your appreciation and experience of things. But not everyone agrees, so fine. I'm not going to drag people kicking and screaming into the criticism chamber in order to make them, do criticism workouts. I mean, if you want to be lazy, be lazy. I don't care. But don't make decisions about what gets saved for posterity and how scarce resources like attention and money get spent.
Levi, we have some questions in the chat related to librarians, and I'm going to selfishly postulate that question since I am a librarian. We have a couple of different people that are curious about this concept of the gatekeepers, and there are a lot of positive things that come out of having artist books in library collections, but perhaps some of you could talk about the drawbacks, if they exist for you, having artist books in circulating libraries, special collections, or maybe some of the things that you wish librarians knew or were doing that are not currently doing that can promote artist book criticism and the awareness of artist books in general.
Megan, I know you mentioned libraries. It sounded like maybe as something to circle back to. Did you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. Well, one idea I've kind of been talking about with a few people, with Corina, who's on here somewhere in one of these boxes as well, is just the idea of how to use libraries as collecting institutions that are available to the public to walk into and view objects, to make that more well-known to writers and to kind of bridge that gap between what a library is collecting and access to the public. So perhaps a monthly newsletter that goes out to interested critics with new additions to the collection this month of artist books and kind of instructions on how to make an appointment to view them and the fact that they are available to see. I think it's interesting to think about these kinds of institutions, as you said, Levi, as gatekeepers. I think that's true, though I'm sort of resistant to that idea because I love libraries and I really think that they are an amazing resource for budding critics who can't afford to buy books, or for publishers that can't afford to send review copies out. I feel like there's a missing link there that we can kind of use, and I haven't quite figured it out yet, but that's something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, different collections have had different policies. As you know, the Arthur Jaffe collection, for instance, down in South Florida, Florida Atlantic, Jaffe made it part of the bequest that the shelves be open and that people be able to go in, browse, look at things. And I know a lot of zine collections very actively involved in that kind of access program. I know that our curators, our librarian curators, are always really keen to show off the books and do classes, get students involved, and so forth. Again, it's a resource issue to some extent, which is, time, and also the, wanting the materials to be used, and yet also wanting to make sure that they do last for, some generations. So the, I think the, I'll stop there. But it is really, again, students love the work and writers love the work. I think, one of the things that Charles Alexander tried to do when he went to the Minnesota Center for Book Arts was really kind of pull the writing community and the book arts community together in a more synthetic way. I think the photography and print world and artists have found their way into artist books more quickly than writers. And, one of the, classic cliche things is that, writers say they're writing a book, but they're not writing a book, they're writing a text. They're not thinking about the book format necessarily. Now, there are plenty of good exceptions to that, but again, I have found it really interesting to work, and give workshops at places like Beyond Baroque, where it's really something aimed at thinking about the book as a writer's medium as well as an artist's medium, and to see what that does for the way people think about the book format as integral to their conception.
That's great. I really liked what you said, Johanna, about the critic helps us to focus on what is of interest because there's just so much stuff. And to me, that is what a librarian does, right? When someone comes with a research question, we work to focus your research on what you can access. So thank you for that. We have another question in the chat for Megan. And the question is, why do you think that people that want to review exhibition catalogs want to review their related exhibition?
Yeah, well, I want to say I'm not saying this as a rule always. I'm actually doing a talk with Center for Book Arts next month that's actually about exhibition catalogs as sort of in the hands of artists, kind of exhibition catalogs as artist books. So I definitely think there are examples of catalogs that are thinking about the book form, but a lot of one of the questions for that talk is what's the function of an exhibition catalog? And for the most part, it's to document the exhibition. So if you can go see the exhibition, then that's kind of the content that you're wanting to write about. Again, if the catalog does something different, I'm always happy to have it. But for the most part, when I do get pitched catalogs, they're for very popular exhibitions. And the writer really just wants to talk about the content of the exhibition and isn't really thinking about what the book is offering outside of that.
Thank you. One more question. It says it's from Backbone Books. How can I start building awareness in this field in Latin America where art is not a priority?
You know, one of my library colleagues, TK Sangwin, has been doing a whole series of talks spotlighting books in Mexico and Latin America. So I would suggest connecting with those communities of already existing artists. You know, I'm gonna fail miserably if I try to remember any of the names and specifics. But there's certainly, you know, enough ongoing active activity in the artist book world to certainly in Mexico is quite developed and multifaceted. But TK Sangwin is my colleague, and you can find her on the UCLA Library website. And I would take a look at the series that she's put together and think about where the start points are for building on that existing community.
I would also just add the note that, you know, it doesn't take that many people or that many interventions to kind of start building bridges and getting things to snowball. You know, one example I can think of is after there was a guest edited version or edition of Jab from Isabel Barona in Portugal,
Yeah.
Every year we continued to get an outsized number of submissions from Portugal, and you know, her own critical publication, like an annual collection, like really has built a lot of momentum. And then once those inroads are made, I think that there's a lot of interest and people are willing to, you know, kind of keep building upon that initial intervention.
Okay, next question. Are any of you aware of any work that's been done on comparing traditions of book criticism in other languages or other national traditions? I'm wondering if there is anything to be gained from a comparativist approach.
Well, there's one very major kind of generative tension in the French tradition versus the Anglo tradition. And by the French tradition here, I'm really sort of referencing Anne Moglen Delcroix, whose name should be mentioned here because of her contributions. And, you know, for Delcroix, the artist book is very defined in classificatory terms, and it begins with Rouchet and is the conceptual work. And so there is an interesting comparison to be made there between that tradition. You know, the French, of course, have a long tradition of the livre d'artiste as well, and also the fine literary press work, which is not the same thing, but they're, you know, sort of in you know, the book club kind of tradition of beautifully made, beautifully illustrated editions, but they're not the deluxe livre d'artiste. And I think if you look at the history of the kind of Russian avant-garde and its engagement with book arts, again, the writings of L. Lissitzky and others, and Ilya Stanevich, they bring a different kind of sensibility into the understanding of book art and criticism. So those would be a few start points, but that's about the limit of my understanding. Again, when I think about in the Journal of Artist Books, there are a number of really, especially in the last sort of the final decade of the Journal of Artist Books, there's a number of really wonderful reports from Germany, from Portugal, from France, from Australia, that bring these different perspectives into view. So I would really encourage people to go back and look at the Journal of Artist Books. I can take no credit at all for any of that work or the editorial or production work. It's all Brad Freeman and print fellows like Levi, but there's a lot of good material in there that's quite sophisticated and shows how far the field had come in the 20-some years that JAB was publishing.
Along those lines, I would say there was an article in JAB by Leszek Burgowski, which was partly about fixed book prices and sort of amount of variation of books available. And, I do think, and it's something I wrote about actually for the CBAA blog as well, is, that the United States doesn't have a price floor under books, which is partly why we don't have a large variety of what's available in independent bookstores. So in tying back to the theme of the panel, thinking about these institutions that kind of entangle the book, that may be one avenue, for a comparative approach to criticism, which, I don't know anything about. I would just say that maybe, comparing the role of these different institutions, the position of bookstores and libraries and the economics of book production would probably be a pretty interesting avenue to approach that.
Does anyone know about a press or publisher or artist that's doing translations of artist books? I don't know any. That's why I'm curious. Ugly Duckling does some, but
yeah, Ugly Duckling does some, and they've been really good about some of those projects. I don't know. Some of my diagrammatic writing has been translated into multiple languages, including Korean, which was just amazing to me. So I know individual works that have been translated, but I don't know that there's any press that's systematically been engaged with that activity. Have you seen anything like that, Megan? Press that's doing it? Yeah, Ugly Duckling is, again, one of the, sort of really serious editorial undertakings in the field of books as cultural production.
There is a new book called Copy, Tweak, Paste, and it's sort of about like appropriation and, in artist books. And one of the things they sort of introduce is this new vocabulary of, I mean, not new, but from other, kind of importing from other disciplines of thinking about facsimiles versus bootlegs versus translations. And in that book, and it's Rob Van Luysen, he mentions some series from publishers, that have done facsimiles, some of which are translated. So not strictly translation, but I think that's like a whole nother avenue that also seems pretty promising of, a new vocabulary to kind of bring in to artist books. Because there's like such a wide range of, facsimiles looking at like some of the futurist books and more like art historical things that have been, published recently, some of which are translated, some aren't, some have new critical material, some don't.
Could you say the name of that book again? It was Copy, Tweak, Paste?
Yeah, Copy, Tweak, Paste, and then there's a subtitle, something about appropriation in artist books, maybe methods of appropriation. Oh, and it's been put into the chat for everyone.
Awesome, love it.
Great, this is great. Okay, so next question says, I am a young scholar with graduate degrees in literature and art history and hope to specialize in artist books in my academic career. I found it difficult to locate potential PhD advisors in art history or literature departments. For people in my situation who do want to seriously engage with artist books in academia, Do you have any advice regarding how to proceed, given the context we've discussed in which artist books are not currently invited into mainstream disciplinary scholarship?
I would love to just speak to this. I don't know who made that comment, but I was you once. That's actually why my BA is in literature and then my master's is in art history. I flipped because I couldn't figure out how to get them together. I think at the time there weren't as many media studies departments as there are now. And so as I was finishing my master's, they were really beginning to pop up and gaining popularity as a place where you could do these more interdisciplinary studies and think about the nature of media, learn about these kind of metadata alongside people who are maybe studying library sciences and literature and art history, and kind of this kind of cross-disciplinary approach that wasn't as available to me at the time. So I think those are great programs. But it's definitely a problem that I think is also part of the issue in the pipeline to creating critics who have the background and vocabulary and skills to approach these objects that do come from, as we've already talked about, so many disciplines.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested actually to hear Aaron's thoughts on the following aspect of this question, because of where you sit, Aaron, which is, you know, my sense is that the College Book Art Association does not have a very large percentage of members who have PhDs. That traditionally book arts have been taught within studio programs. So the master's degree has been the terminal degree, such a terrible phrase, final degree. It's like, we know all degrees are terminal, but I mean, I think, the question of where this sits within disciplines has been a problem for a long time. When I taught at Virginia, where we had rare book school and we had the English department, we had these two polar opposites, right? We had all these people in the English department who read books and never looked at them. We had all these people in rare books who looked at books and never read them. All right, and someplace in between these two things, right? We needed to forge, the space for the future Megans of this world. But I just want to call attention to the work of someone I think is absolutely superb in this regard, and that's Anna Arner, whose work has been, she had a fantastic book on Mallarmé, and actually this morning, she had sent me an article about a 2020 publication on reading the book within exhibit contexts where they're really sculptural, installational, and thinking about why these works have such resonance, how the book is a cultural icon or a symbol sort of works. But, she's, an academic who's engaged with book arts. And again, Matt Kirschenbaum and Leah Price and my colleague Danny Snelson. I mean, I think for any kind of PhD work, what you have to do is find somebody at an institution doing the work you want to do, and then you apply to the institution, because for something, all PhD work is fairly specialized. So you do want to identify a mentor in advance of applying to a program. That would be my advice. I know it's very prosaic, but but tell me, I mean, Aaron, do you see many PhDs within the College Book Art Association, or am I correct in my perception, or what's your thought?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, it's built, like it sort of was initially built out of studio programs. And that remains, I think, kind of the core of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've been making an effort to get more librarians and scholars and critics and things as members of the organization. But I think, yeah, there hasn't been as many, because again, that's not where it formed. Thinking about what you were just saying, Johanna, about sort of like the English departments and art departments and things like that. Like my job at my school, I'm situated in the library and I work across the college. Academically, I actually tend to work more with the English department than I do with our art department, which to me is really interesting. They're both wonderful departments filled with wonderful people. But just in terms of like the curriculum, like that's where the interest is. And that also made me think of, like in terms of thinking about PhD programs, like a program, like a literary program that also is maybe like has a strong connection to a studio program, like the University of Utah is one, where Craig Dworkin is. came to mind. I know Anne Royston, who wrote a wonderful book about artist books, came to that program. And so, yeah, so that would just be another thing. I'm also come from a studio background, right? So that's where my bias is as well. I tend to think in those terms.
Yeah, this is something that I'm actually interested in thinking about the disciplinary backgrounds of future critics and of writers of artist book criticism, is the fact that out of the four of us, I didn't even realize this, Levi, until you said it in the intro, I'm the only one who doesn't make books. I'm not an artist. So this kind of studio MFA artist practitioners as critic is very interesting to me. And I wonder what people's thoughts are on that, or if I saw someone in the chat mentioning at some point in time that everyone who writes about artist books should take a bookbinding class or some kind of making class. And that's something that's really interesting to me. I've taken printmaking classes, but I've never made a book. So I'm familiar with printing processes, not as familiar with the mechanics of making bindings, though I know a bit about them, having studied artist books for many years now. But I'm just interested if you have any thoughts on this as a kind of another institution, the MFA or artist studio practice institution that leads to criticism.
I mean, I'll, for one thing, just commiserate because I'm actually in the process of applying to art history PhD programs. So I don't know how much advice I would have if the person who asked that question doesn't want to email me. I could at least, share how that process has been for me. And I will also say that as a moderator for the CBAA blog, two of the submissions that I've solicited from people here at University of Missouri have been from the English department to doctoral students in creative writing that have been really interesting. One focusing more on pedagogy and one like pretty straight theory and criticism. But I do think a lot of what we've talked about within the College Book Art Association is looking at like the incentive structure for, even like with peer-reviewed publications, which, take a lot of time and it's a lot to ask of somebody, both to have reviewers and for the person writing it. If you are in an academic, like in an MFA program, you don't get a lot of credit as far as tenure and promotion for all of that work. It's just not really like baked into the structure. So I wonder if in that regard, the academic home of, some of the artist books and where the criticism is coming from is maybe to the detriment of criticism.
Okay, one other question that I think might be particularly relevant in the time of COVID-19 is, would the reviewers among you consider reviewing a book based on photos / description and or a video of all the pages? What other ideas do you have for reviewing a very limited object?
For me, I would not consider that. I actually make it a rule that my reviewers cannot write from a PDF or something like that. They have to see the book. If they, for whatever reason, can't get a review copy, I do my best to create opportunities for them to see the book in person and just use the PDF as reference. I think based on everything we've talked about today, and I'm sure will continue to come up throughout the conference, the material interaction with the book is really key to what makes it so unique and exciting as an artwork. And if you can't have that, the documentation alone isn't going to do it. Like I said, I'm also trying to problem solve ways to get smaller edition runs of books into the hands of my reviewers. If it's possible to loan a review copy, if it's possible to, it's hard during COVID, but to go visit it in the library or even, drop it off at someone's home for a short period of time. If you live in the neighborhood, all these ways of trying to share the physical objects, I think is really, really important to being able to appropriately review the object.
Yeah, I totally agree, Megan. You know, I mean, I once wrote a piece called The Calisthenics of Composition that had to do with the physical acts of writing, like what it means to write on a mechanical typewriter, what it means to, you know, hold type in your hands, draw on a stone, and so forth. These things are so physical. And I would suggest a pendant piece to that, which is the ergonomics of criticism, which is that, you know, there's a kind of physical business of the space from which you read. And as again, you know, when you're working with people who are developing a project, the first thing I say to them is you have to print it out. You can't see what something is on the screen. You don't know what the scale is. You don't know what the reading distance is. You don't know what any of the sort of like, you know, basic physiological engagement and cognitive engagement with that object is. And we've all been in exhibits where somebody's made a book that's so big, there's no viewing angle from which you can look at it, right? It's like that. So that's a statement. What's it about? But it's not about reading. It's not about engaging. But, you know, I would suggest another thing. Yeah, I got you in mind, Megan, for this, which is the Artist Books Roadshow. Okay, so, you know, couldn't we have fun having visiting critics come and work with you to sort of, people bring their books and it's like, okay, you know, the critic sees it cold. You have to go through as we've been doing in the book clinics. And, you know, you say, okay, look, this is working here. This is really great. Let's see, you know, you pull to attention the things that are really engaging and interesting about a work. And every once in a while, you might have to say, well, you might want to rethink, you know, using banana peels as your binding, you know, or whatever. So, you know, anyway, so yeah, I think, you know, something like that would be really fun.
I love that idea. Yeah. And I would just echo what you said. Something that I, in my own writing about artist books, I'm especially interested in is the relationship of the book and the body. And you're just not going to get a scale is obviously missing when you're looking at documentation of something, even if you have those videos with the person's hands. I mean, it's not really the same thing. I will also then say one flip side of this is I do think there's such a thing as a digital native artist book. So for those kinds of projects, certainly they can be experienced in a different way. And that's something we haven't really talked at all about, but I think that's definitely possible. If the form that the book takes is digital, then I'm happy to experience it that way.
And I can say for artist book reviews, this was the first pushback and question that I consistently got was people that either, you know, worked in very small edition sizes or just didn't, you know, have the funds to mail something. And, you know, I think, and I have to give all the credit to my partner, Carly Gomez, who, you know, sort of gave me the solution when I was really troubled by this, because it does have like real implications for equity and accessibility. And, you know, she just said, well, why don't you just open like a limited, you know, reading period, like 1 month of the year where, you know, you can, instead of just receiving hard copies and keeping them, you can open it up and have people pitch it to you using photos, videos, etc. So I'm not ever going to write the review based on that. But what I will do is take email submissions in whatever form, you know, there's no like strict guidelines, just whatever the artist thinks best presents the work. And then I will tell people like, yes, I'll review that. And then in that case, 1 month out of the year, sort of for the purposes of equity, I pay for that and I pay to have them ship it and ship it back. And then there's sort of partially subsidized ones, which as opposed to like trying to worry so much about that, it's more people that have, you know, a unique object and they just want it back. In that case, they pay for shipping, but I'll still let them take it back. You know, the mechanics of that are really tricky, but I do think it's important to at least have that as an option, because I do think making sure that everybody who wants access to critical attention for their work can get it. And then I am curious to hear Aaron talk about this, because I think his work is maybe like the most kind of in between digital and analog and back and forth between. So this idea of like a native digital artist book, or even like what you can make of an artist book in the digital space, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Sure. One thing I wanted to mention too about this idea of like reviewing books and things like that. One thing that I'm really excited about for an upcoming sort of publication imprint that I'm going to be working with a poet named Divya Victor on is just building. They're going to be like small editions, 30 books probably, but building in like X amount of copies, 2 or 3 from every edition, not for reviews necessarily, but to send to people to teach them. And I'm sure other artists have done this in the past, but just like say like 3 copies are like the teaching copies. We put this, really neat packaging system together. We send them out, they send them back. And the editions just get destroyed through use. And we just like, they're just that's like what happens to them. And I think that's fine. So I'm excited about that for future projects, to kind of get around some of these access things. To your question about the digital native stuff, I won't talk about it for a long time, but for me, right, like artist books are text, image, and time. And so like other things, like a GIF is also can be that, right? A PDF can be that, a website can be that. So many things can be that. And I've been playing around really rudimentary kind of animations and GIFs and stuff, and just having a blast, like thinking about how all these things work together. So it's like a very, I'm really interested in also like digital republication, again, which Ugly Duckling Press is really good at, and other kinds of things like that, thinking about ways to do that.
I love that concise 3 text, image, time. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, I would add materials. And I'll be the contrarian and say digital books aren't books, just because somebody's got to say it. And I believe that they're not, but that's okay.
Can I ask you why? Sorry, I know there's other. Can I ask you why you don't think they're books?
Well, because to me, a book is a physical object. I mean, it really is. I think there are features of, development, sequence, unfoldingness, time, space that occur in a film, and a film is not a book. So that's all. I think a digital artifact is a digital artifact. It does different kinds of things. So, I mean, again, I'll just be contrarian, but I want to pick up on a thread that's been going through the questions. It has to do with unique books. And Molly Schwartzberg, my former colleague at Virginia, poses this question about the issue of access makes it hard for unique books to get attention. And so, yeah, there's great electronic literature, exactly. So I totally agree. So the unique book. So this is, again, where the Artist Book Roadshow is going to really make a difference, because people can show up with their precious, unique, wonderful, one of a kind. They can bring it in a baby buggy, and it can be in case, and bring it out and have it discussed and talked about. It would be great, because again, there are things that need to be made simply as unique objects. And, nobody has a problem, with the idea that there's only one Mona Lisa, right? It's like it gets plenty of attention. And, so, I think, it is an issue of access. And Molly's right. It gets very difficult to be able to, and when we did Century of Artist books, it was the one area that was really hard for us, because editioned books show up in lots of collections. Unique books, are often really difficult to find, let alone look at. So again, I think, calling attention to them and appreciating them and seeing how they work is great. And really, I think, at least 5 minutes of every Artist Book Roadshow should be dedicated to a unique book.
The comments in the chat here are just so great. All these people having conversations about their unique books and the problems of purchasing them for institutions, of traveling them. It's thanks to all the really thoughtful participants here.
Yeah, I also make unique books, and it's like a real problem. But I love doing them, and they like do this other thing that printed books can't. And so, but it is a huge problem. But yeah, and again, like the idea of like even like shipping them around, which would be horrible and terrifying, right? But so Levi or Megan could review them, like what a wonderful opportunity that would be, but also like, yeah, yikes, right?
This is fantastic. Thank you all so much. We're about 5 minutes over, so I'm gonna stop the recording, but I'm gonna leave the room open if people want to continue to chat and ask questions. Thank you all so much to the presenters. Thank you all for attending. This was wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you all being here.
Well, it's really fun to meet all of you online, and thank you guys for organizing and get that roadshow going, Megan.
And Gianna, thanks for all your work monitoring the chat and making all this go so smoothly.
Sure.
Yeah,
No,
thanks.
lots of interest still going on, so I would encourage all of you to scroll through in case I missed anything essential.
I do need to go to another meeting, unfortunately, since it's still workday here in California.
Yeah,
So,
thank you for being here.
yeah,
Thank
I
you.
look forward to future conversations. Thanks all.
Sounds
Bye.
good.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you to everyone for being here, to organizing all the good things. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
for doing
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Do we stay now or?
I think it would be good if, if people want to continue the chat, they can do so in the chat box on the Virtual Art Book Fair website. There's a lot of people who have actually been commenting on the presentation there throughout the entire thing. I could see Paul Short saying, "Great talk, thank you so much." So that could be a really great place to continue the conversation. And then we have the critical convening session coming up at 5 p.m. So we'll be doing that here in the same Zoom room.
Corina, will the chat from today be saved somewhere?
Yes, yeah. If the presenters want a copy of that, we can definitely provide it.
There's so many wonderful comments. It's so interesting. I was trying to read the questions and pay attention to everyone at the same time, which is a skill I don't think I have. And they're just so great. They're just so great.
Yeah, I think also that, all the resources and links that you all referenced during your presentations, it'd be great if we could compile a list of those to put on the website so that those are part of the archive for this session for CABC, because there were a lot of people asking about that. So it would be good to compile that. So I'll probably be reaching out to you all about gathering those.
Yeah, I'd love to see all the chat logs too.
Yeah, okay.
Great to virtually meet all of you. I'll come back on at 5. See you then.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to jet so that you all can also think about your next presentation.
Oh yeah, all right.
All
Good seeing you.
right. Thanks. I'll see you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Megan.
Yeah, I guess I'll be back at 5 then also.
Yeah. Should we just log back in at 5?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
All right.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you,
See you
Levi,
then.
for organizing this. This was
thank
this
you.
was great. Really great. Thank you.
Really great. Thanks.
Great work, guys. Hey guys, how's it going?
Not bad.
Not bad. We are just waiting for two discussion instigators, Cohick and David Sr. And we'll be getting started. Oh, there's Cohick. We'll be getting started in just a minute. Okay, thank you, Tiffany. Let me fix that. Okay. Is everyone in the Zoom room? Can they turn on their cameras? Let's see. Cohick and Megan, does it work for you as well? Yes, good. Let me see. The only person then we're waiting for is David.
Megan says it's not working.
Megan says it's not working. Okay, let me.
Can't turn on mic or camera.
There's so many people entering the waiting room that it's like I try to click on it and then it jumps away. Okay, did that work, Megan? Yep. Okay, there's David. Okay.
People are just dying to get in. 46 people in the waiting room, man.
I know.
Very timely crew.
Very timely. Okay, and I'm just gonna. So I've already assigned everyone to their breakout rooms, and the rest of the participants will be sorted in randomly. So just so that you know, you're all going to have your own breakout room. Cohick, you're the last one. Okay, great.
And you remind me how we're sort of exiting the breakout rooms.
So basically, well, there will be a message that shows up to everyone, and it'll say, you know, there are 60 seconds before the breakout room is going to, you know, bring you back to the main room, and it'll be kind of like a warning. And then at that point, you kind of have the option to rejoin the main room, or after 60 seconds is up, it'll pull you back in. But I'll try to keep you guys, you know, up to date with updates.
Okay, just wasn't sure whether we had to do something or you were going to do it centrally.
Nope, it's all going to be happening.
And what's the timestamp for coming back to the larger discussion?
So we're going to do the small discussions for 15 minutes and then come back and regroup, have a little bit of large group discussion, then go back in and do another 15-minute discussion.
And we just deem a note taker to use the Google Doc that you shared in the email, right?
Yep, and I'm going to share that also in the chat. So after I let everyone in. Okay, I think I'm going to start to admit people. You guys ready? Yep. Okay, great. Turn off the waiting room. And okay, good point. I am going to enable the ability for participants to turn on their camera. And after the introduction, I'm going to also enable the ability for participants to turn on their microphone. So, and Megan, whenever you are ready, whenever you think, it looks like we have about 62 people in the room. So whenever you're ready, take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Corina. Thank you all for joining us here today for this conversation, for this convening on terminology and contextualizing historic material. It's part of the larger Contemporary Artist Book Conference, but also specifically part of the Book Art Review Initiative. Book Art Review, founded by Corina Reynolds, David Solo, and myself, was launched in late 2020 with Center for Book Arts to promote and strengthen art book criticism and artist book criticism. It has many evolving parts, including a forthcoming web and print journal, a prize for artist book criticism, and a series of critical programming, of which this event today is the start. Our goal is to provide resources for critical writing about the book arts. Our activities are built around an evolving set of core principles, which you can see on our website. I don't know if you can drop the link in the chat, Corina, at some point during this talk. And we want to engage existing critical writers to consider artist books in the topics of contemporary art we are already covering. We want to strengthen the quality of existing writing in the field. And we want to encourage new and emerging writers to write about book art. This afternoon, we have invited a selection of international scholars and critics to join you, the book arts community and the community of writers, in a public conversation about how to achieve these goals. We'll take stock of the current state of criticism for the book arts, identify what is currently preventing the growth of critical discourse around this medium, create stable resources to support arts writers now, and develop ways to close the gap between book art criticism and that of other mediums. Our topics for these conversations came out of smaller private meetings Book Art Review conducted, where we asked how to solve the problem of expanding artist book criticism. Today, we will talk about the problem of terminology. How does inadequate, inconsistent, or unclear terminology limit our ability to write critically about artist books? And our second topic for this evening will be how to contextualize historical artist books and how artist books contextualize historical material. More details on that when we come back from the first topic. I'll now just pass the mic over to Corina, who will guide us through the logistics of how this conversation will go and the breakout room conversations. Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me do this. So hello, everyone. My name is Corina Reynolds. I'm the Executive Director of Center for Book Arts. Thank you, Megan, for explaining all of that stuff. I'm going to get into the nuts and bolts of everything here because this session is a little bit different than the other conference sessions and probably a little bit different from the other events that you've been attending at the Virtual Art Book Fair. So first of all, I'm going to share a link with everyone in the chat right now. This link is to a Google Doc that everyone is welcome to add to. It's going to become a resource for everyone who is attending, as well as a place where we're keeping a record of all of our conversations that we have in this session today. So you can open it up. It's in a Google Doc. All of you have the ability to edit and add. And so that is important because we are all going to be breaking up into small breakout rooms. So we're not going to stay in the large Zoom room like we are right now. We're going to be in small groups of about 6 to 8 people, and each group will have its own discussion instigator. If you are a discussion instigator, let's see, I guess you are all at the top of the participants list. You could wave your hand, say hello, smile. We have, let's see here, we have Tiffany Barber, Colette Gator, Megan Liberty, Kanohi Nishikawa, David Sr., Tate Shaw, Levi Sherman, Vivian Sming, David Solo, and Kayla Romberger with us today. And so when you get sorted into your breakout room, these discussion instigators will be here to help you work through the conversation around the questions that Megan posed earlier. So the idea is that we're trying to get as much of a broad overview of everyone's opinions about these topics, ideas. We're kind of crowdsourcing a little bit. And let's see. The second thing that you need to know is once you get into your breakout room, each group is going to have to designate a note taker. So if you are a note-taking type person, feel free to nominate yourself when you enter your small breakout room. Otherwise, your discussion instigator might pick somebody. So just a warning that that's going to come up, and you'll be asked to take those notes in the Google Doc that I just shared. So the way it's going to happen is we're just going to automatically randomly assign people into these groups. You're going to be zoomed away into a smaller Zoom room, and you're going to have about 15 to 20 minutes for discussion before everyone is returned to the main group, where we're going to kind of recap and share out what we had in our small groups. Then we're going to talk about the next question. We'll all go back into our same groups and we'll have more discussion, and then we'll come back again to summarize. At this point, I would like to ask if anyone has a question, could you pop that in the chat? I'm going to finish setting up a couple of, because we had a few more participants join, I'm going to add them to the breakout rooms. So here we go. And then I'll be sending you all away in just a moment. Discussion instigators, do you have any questions or any comments that you would like to bring before we zoom out into our individual rooms? No, okay. All right. Okay, everybody. See you in a minute. Zoom information. Hey guys. So you're joining a little bit late, so I'm going to, we already broke out into our individual small groups. So I'm going to add you to a group discussion that's already happening. Did you have a question?
No, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the question that we're discussing right now is, oh, and also let me give you the link. Hey guys. Hey. So you're joining a little bit late, so I'm going to, we already broke out into our individual small groups. So I'm going to add you to a group discussion that's already happening. Pause this. Did you have a question?
No, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the question that we're discussing right now is, oh, and also let me give you the link. Hey guys. Hey. So you're joining a little bit late, so I'm going to, we already broke out into our individual small groups. What's going on there? Ah, hi, Alex. Alex, can you hear me?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, hi.
Okay, so
How are you?
I'm good. It's good to see you.
Yeah, I'm running late. Isn't that 5?
Yeah, it started at 5. So we already went out into our small
Oh, your chat rooms. I didn't know there's chat rooms. Okay.
So I can add you in to a room that's already in progress. We have let's see here. This is the link to the Google Doc that we're taking notes in, but your group should already have a note taker designated. And right now we're discussing the question of how does inadequate, inconsistent, or unclear terminology limit our ability to write critically about artist books?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna assign you.
No problem. Thank you. I had to go to the post office, drop something off, and it just, the line was crazy.
Oh yeah.
Because I was at the 3 o'clock and I left at 4:10, and then I just got back. Spent an hour there.
Okay, let me just, I'm gonna put you in with Kinohi. All right.
So great.
Okay, good. Did that work out well?
Yeah.
Okay. Everyone should be returning. Look at all these different people. All right, let's just give everyone a second to return from their breakout rooms. I saw lots of typing going on in this document. It looks so active. It's so exciting. Okay. All right, so welcome back, everyone. Do we have an interesting discussion so far? Yeah, okay. So I was hoping that you all could maybe share out like one or two interesting points that came out of your small group discussion. Maybe the discussion instigators could unmute themselves or wave your hands and then unmute yourself so that we know who's going to speak first. But yeah, let's hear what you guys, what the different conversations were. Colette.
We got into a discussion of intentionality. I used the example of James Castle, who is an outsider artist. I don't know who's familiar with him, but he made, I see some heads nodding. He made books sometimes out of things that were already bound. You know, he made a book on top of another book as an outsider artist, and he did not speak. Yeah, he didn't speak. I don't know if he could hear, but he didn't speak. So nobody knew what his intentions were, what he was doing, what he thought he was doing. So that was something that we talked about. There are times when you don't know what a person's intention was in making what they made. And you know, I think we should look at it as a book. I think that when you're writing about these things, as a writer, you can decide this is a book, this is an artist's book, and I'm going to write about it from that point of view, whether that's how the person made it or not. And so, you know, what the other things that we talked about were, the idea of accidental books, things that are books that weren't intended, again, weren't made specifically as books. Someone talked about concrete poetry and how that figures into aesthetics of books and aesthetics of words on a page, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Tiffany, did you want to respond or share something from your group?
Yeah, I just was going to piggyback off of what Colette said in terms of these like just a discussion about what constitutes an artist book. And is it a fine art object? Is it, you know, what actually is its status, and who gets the right to call it that and or assign value to it? So we had a lot of different backgrounds represented in my breakout room. And so relatedly, we also talked about using language and terminology to invite and attract different publics so that we can start to diversify and decolonize the kind of idea that the artist book space and print culture in general is like, you know, kind of white, predominantly white. And then again, related to what Colette's group talked about, the kind of audience, like who, when you're writing about artist books, like who are you speaking to? What kinds of expectations are there in terms of the form of the writing? Is it, you know, if you're writing an exhibition catalog essay, obviously more formal language or jargon, but you can push against that and use more common terms, a more colloquial language. But if you're, you know, if you're an appraiser, then you have to, you're kind of up against bureaucratic processes. So that was a little bit of the conversation that we had.
That's very interesting. Did anyone else touch on the idea of audience?
Part of, yeah, I was going to say, building a little bit on what I think Tiffany was talking, you know, we talked about the notion of a little bit of different audiences, but particularly we spent some time talking about both helping out people new to the field, but also to students and makers. And so a lot of times people who are coming through student programs have a challenge describing and talking about their work. And so, you know, looking at how to put together a vocabulary and potentially keeping it smaller sort of helps with both the clarity, but also talking about dealing with cross-cultural and language issues that, thinking about sort of one path of this that is addressed to that, new to the field, or I'm a student and or a new maker of objects who wants to talk about their work could be very helpful. And we started collecting some examples of some projects and work that's going on in that area. Some of it also builds on collaborative ideas and some of the wiki kind of model of helping to maintain descriptions and examples.
That's interesting. Oh, sorry, Tate, did you want to go? I was just going to say, it seems like some of the discussions ballooned out a bit more. Ours touched a little bit more on what Colette said. Intentionality did come up in ours, but ours stayed pretty focused on specific terms and how certain disciplines have a history that's already established for terms. For example, architecture, whereas book art broadly, each specific term, book art, art book, artist book, book arts, book work, has its own connotations, and that perhaps there's a way to create a resource document that links, rather than trying to define those terms. Someone in my group brought up this amazing word, circumlocation. So this idea of talking around something without having to define it. So creating a lineage of how these terms have been used in the past. And part of that conversation is the intention of the maker and the critic when they use those terms coming into play there.
I would just piggyback on that. We did a kind of unofficial survey around everybody around certain terms: book art, artist books, book works, art book, thinking about what is more inviting, what art book being a kind of bigger umbrella for getting people to fairs, et cetera, versus bookworks, which has a little more openness, a little less, distillation of what we're talking about to create more open possibilities. One of the things that I took away from it most, I think, and other people can weigh in, is the idea of, Jazz mentioned this idea of iterative learning that one does in critical reading, where we're understanding what the work is in terms of the social groups, the scope of history, the relational practice that is implied through the writing itself, explicitly or implicitly, and we understand what these terms are better as that iterative process plays out.
Well, I'll just also add to that, and someone from my group can totally jump in as well, but we did talk about the different terminologies and how I think there was like some back and forth in terms of like, there does seem to be like a need for definitions to just even move, have the conversation and to kind of provide a framework to push back against, but then also recognizing that that in different languages, those terms have like very specific historical lineages that also add to that conversation. And then also this sort of this sentiment being expressed about just needing to be done with this kind of terminology of infighting and just move forward to really start talking about the field and what folks have shared in terms of intentionality. Yeah, I think that was from our group.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's maybe a good segue into the next question, thinking about history and recontextualizing. So how can and should we or contextualize historical artist books? And as Megan said earlier, I think that there are all kinds of different ways to think about this question. And so I urge you all to have as diverse a conversation about this as you like. All right, is everyone ready to go back into their groups? Yep, okay, all right.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you? I'm afraid I've just jumped in very belatedly, so I'm just gonna listen.
Okay, I'm gonna drop you into a room. Okay.
Okay.
I'll
jumped in belatedly too. Sorry. I was very late.
You.
Conflicting
Hi there, Eva. Are you there? Can you hear me? We've just gone into breakout groups. Can I?
Oh, okay. Hi.
Can I add you to a breakout room?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to put you in with David Sr. We are talking about recontextualizing historic materials.
Okay.
Here you go.
Thanks.
Hi, Harris. How are you? Can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Am I the first person on here?
Well, no, actually, we already went into breakout rooms. So we are discussing the question of how can and should we recontextualize historical artist books? And the discussion's already started, but I'd love to add you into one of these small groups if you'd like.
Okay, great. I guess I got the timing wrong then. Sorry about that.
No, it's
okay. I might have to, I was planning to sort of tune in quietly.
Yeah, well, if you want to do that, then we will be actually coming back to the large room in about 5 minutes.
And how long is this meant to go on after this?
It's going to go on until about 6:30, so another half hour.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess it's the time zones. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Yeah. So if you want to hang out, you'll be able to watch the live stream on the Printed Matter.
Oh yeah, okay. Maybe I'll go ahead and do that then. But I appreciate you saying hi.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Enjoy. Yeah, you too.
Okay. Hi, Robin, and maybe this is Kelsey, I'm not sure. We are about to come out of our breakout rooms, and we're going to have the large group discussion. So if you guys want to hang out for about a couple minutes, actually, it's going to be about 2 more minutes, then you can join in that conversation. Otherwise, maybe tune in for the next session tomorrow.
Great, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. I'm not sure.
Hi, Corina.
We are about to come out of our breakout rooms, and I hate that. Oh, is that on your computer? Yeah, you must have the live stream open. All right. Okay. Everyone should be returning in a few minutes here. Okay. Let's take a look at that Google Doc. Whoa. Nemina, hi. Hey, people are coming back. Welcome back. Hello. Good to see everyone. Okay, let's give it a moment. Everyone make it back. Okay. All right. So how was this session? Was it easier, harder, more interesting? More interesting. Yeah. Tiffany, I see you shaking your head. Yes. Do you have something you want to start off with?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't know if it was more interesting per se, but I think that because there were people from the first session that were also included in the second session of my breakout room, we kind of had a starting point to launch from, which picked up where the group discussion left off. And so we went back to this idea, these kind of early conversations about definition as a way into the question of terminology, or as a way into the question of historical context. And so we talked about some of the problems actually that we have with the way that history even operates within this field. So that comes with like, limiting terms like if the artist's book or object predates the 1960s, for instance, and is outside of the US, terms like primitive or outsider can be actually dismissive and offensive, right? And so the call or the demand for more dimensionality and nuance in terms of place versus process. So rather than calling it from the Western context or, non-Western context, saying what it's actually like, describing what the book is actually doing or how it's made through pouring or, things like that. So thinking about process. And then also thinking about avant-gardism and experimentation as part of the artist's book narrative that was actually trying to evacuate the confines of the art market, which in fact we're kind of back in, right? And so how do we agitate and how do we make like a kind of anti-artist book or something like that? So those are just a few thoughts.
Yeah. Who wants to respond?
I'll just say that process came up, and though we didn't use that term exactly, we built on our first session where we really wanted to expand the way we describe artist books to encompass something like performance. And Erin Michelson had a really lovely way of putting it. As a cataloger, when she describes artist books, she conceives her task as describing an experience that you move through, so that all the sensuousness and immersiveness of engaging with that book, what Tiffany just said, what it does, is kind of conveyed through the description. Now, given that provisional kind of method, we then took on the task of, well, how do you describe historical artist books? And what we came to realize is that there are so many artist books under that rubric that haven't been recognized as such. And this gets us into the question of decolonizing our notion of the history of artist books, which is that we want to open up the definition of the artist book beyond its binding and beyond its codex form, to begin to include contained but not bound experiences with information, with different kinds of art. And so in that regard, we began to open up our conversation to Kipu, wampum, African-American quilt traditions as one way of thinking about the artist books beyond a particular bound object. Because again, we were working from a method that was describing an experience of something you move through, not just anything and everything, an infinite possibility, but a kind of enclosure or containment that was not bound, that invited you in, and our task is to describe the experience of moving through that. Thank you.
I guess we have kind of a follow-up or a twist on that as well. I had sort of started the conversation off thinking about what are some of the disciplines we come from, what vocabulary and traditions and histories are we borrowing from. But out of like the 6 people in the group, one person has a background in offset printing, one person came from commercial publishing. You know, I have a graphic design background and currently work in, you know, publishing, academic publishing as a day job. So I think that part of the history or the, you know, language we have to preserve is also these trades and these processes that do have like blue collar or trade origins, or at least are tied up in those, you know, those histories and those economics. And trying to help people traverse like the gap, you know, somebody that has that background, say in trade publishing and in art practice or an interest in art, how can the vocabulary sort of be the bridge instead of like a barrier between those two worlds? You know, how can we bring those people into artist books?
One, you know, we also had sort of some people with perhaps more background in some of the historical archive and related areas. And there was a strong sense that there's not clearly anything or very much about this that is specific to the artist book world. And that this has become such a broad topic, and there's some very extensive sort of experience and guidance in dealing this with processing historical archives and related material, that, you know, we might not have to invent or solve this problem. You know, we may have to tailor it a little bit in concert with some of the terminology and otherwise, but that, you know, this is a very broad cross-media, cross-everything topic being dealt with. And so sort of talking about, you know, some of, you know, where we can potentially leverage rather than, you know, trying to come up with things. There was sort of one other interesting or sort of different interpretation of the problem statement, you know, which had to do with looking at sort of pre-20th century artist books and deciding whether you think of them or needed a whole different language and context around, you know, what being an artist book means, you know, in the context of Blake or something like that. And so there was, you know, leaving aside the problematic content, there was a question of whether the same language in talking about, you know, books made by artists with some of that intent in, you know, earlier centuries is a different flavor of the question. And we didn't get into that too much, but it was an interesting, you know, answer to the question of, well, what about these, you know, 19th, 18th century examples? So those were some of the things that came out of our discussion.
Yeah, I think we had something similar. I mean, we kind of had like a for or against moment, like, you know, why recontextualize, why not kind of conversation, and for and against or whatever. But I mean, we landed on how it pointed to the first question and the contradictions in it, and that there is that issue of like not only the difficulty of agreeing on the terms, but then there's the historical perspective of it, or what, you know, where does it begin and end? So at what point is an artist book an artist book? When is it something else? And I would say that in large part, my group made great arguments for an artist book being many things, including cave painting. So, you know, we also had the unbound perspective, I would say. I don't know, that was my observations from the group, but I would say the general consensus is yes, contextualization is important because, you know, history is changing, we're changing, and we want it to be accessible. We want it to mark and be able to discuss those points in history in which they're made. So that was some of the take home we got from it.
Well, we had a, you know, similar discussion about, and some people are very adamantly, what's the word, protagonists of the book as a codex, as a certain kind of object. But you know, there were some of us, myself included, who say that that is just so restrictive. You know, like even the idea of a book, and as I pointed out, 150, 200 years ago, people might have one book. You know, in their house, and it wasn't a common thing, and it was, I guess, you know, one of the things that we came up with was the elitism of book arts, the way that they are configured now. And the idea isn't to just, drag things in and say, oh yeah, this is an artist book. But my concern is, what are we missing? Like what is out there that we haven't seen or considered or studied because they were looked at a certain kind of way, and everybody had really interesting things to say. And I totally get, I love books, and I'm not saying that sounds condescending, but I totally get being really wedded to this idea. And this is the thing, this is why these habits and conventions and categories are so hard to break, because people have spent so much time and energy creating them and, and valuing them and creating this whole history. That doesn't have to go away. We just have to think about how it gets expanded.
I think that was the place where we sort of ended too, is like the idea of expanding through more inclusion of more critics of color, more curators of color, and also more diverse voices in terms of library cataloging and access that might lead to research potential for work, and by doing so, expand to other than Western Codex forms because of multi-dimensional histories coming to these works. Largely, so far, you're dealing with a pretty one-dimensional frame through which to look, at least in terms of canons or collections of critical writing and so forth. And therefore, more voices leads to different perspectives in general.
There were also some sort of comments raised about, for whatever path this goes, the challenges potentially smaller institutions and organizations and other would have, and so the notion of needing models or whatever we call it that deal with sort of very different scales of resource and institution and structure, as well as sort of crossing international boundaries. And we had a fairly international group, and so the challenges of doing this, and then what reasonable expectations are and what tools would be as things sort of move into different scales of organization in different countries, was just flagged. We didn't really get to explore it too much.
Are there any other groups that we haven't heard from yet?
Hey there. We had a few librarians and librarian students in my group, so the conversation skewed in that direction. Particularly in their vein of recontextualization. I really feel very seriously that my job, I run a library in an art museum, a modern and contemporary art museum that collects artist books. My job right now is to recontextualize the collection in ways that changes its grounding in ways that recognize that the history of the collection is steeped in colonialism, in patriarchal and racist structures. The museum itself is something that needs to question itself right now. And the work that we do in the library is part of the work to question that background and where we are as an institution. But in terms of the material in the library collection too, and questions of recontextualization, I'm often guided by groups of students that I'm showing stuff to, and it being clear that if you follow some of the trajectory of what's considered canonical artist publications, there's real problems with who's represented and who isn't. And I'm guided in my collection development and writing new policy for collections is that question of putting stuff out for students and what people can learn from that. And it makes the collection better as it shifts or changes. Not to say that there's not work still to be done, but I think from a librarian or an institutional perspective, there's issues of collection development. There's issues of controlled vocabulary that are constant, and we need voices from the outside to affect that vocabulary. And at the same time, we can help people within these conversations to understand that they don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel in terms of controlled vocabulary, but also there's real assistance needed as well. I don't know if that last part makes sense, but and I think within the book fair, you can see an attempt to recontextualize what we're talking about. All of these different tribes within the book fair, there's people that make t-shirts, people make cassettes. I like the term artist publications because it fits a broad umbrella. Maybe it doesn't work totally with like unique things, but artist publications works for me broadly in terms of like getting at the variety of things. But anyway, I'll stop talking. Thanks.
If I could just add a little bit to what David was just saying, it came up surprisingly in my second conversation with my group. There was a librarian there, and we talked a little bit about the resources of the curatorial department versus the library, and then how that impacts who gets to collect what kinds of materials, and then how that changes the way that a user or visitor or reader can access those materials, whether they enter the curatorial collection or the library. And from that, I just thought I was actually really surprised at how much overlap there was between these two topics. When we were first generating these sessions as BAR, we were thinking about these as being kind of two separate topics, but immediately in my group, as many of you have echoed, there was a lot of overlap on how the terminology itself needs to be contextualized historically, how the two go back and forth, how these things are so related in a way that I actually was really excited to see.
At this point, I'm going to open it up. If there's anyone else who really wants to say something, please unmute yourself. We have, I guess, about 5 minutes left. So I'm open it.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just real quick here.
Yeah, you need to mute.
It's somebody else's noise. The first thing I could just say is that we're taking inventory of ourselves, right? And I'd say the other thing that other people hinted to, I think you need to take inventory of what your audience is capable of, right? And that sounds like really general and whatever it is, but like there's another side to the coin here, right? We can have people that represent what we think is some other groups, right? That concludes. But in some ways, the conversation has to also go into like, who are we talking to versus at, right? So the wider scope is that, you know, if I'm, and this is a total generalization, if I have a bunch of fifth graders or whatever we're going to call that group, I'm not going to talk quantum physics, right? So that other part of who we're talking to, even though we can have representatives of what we think that group sees, right, to put in spots or whatever, the general notion of consciousness, right, has to go to who are we talking to and and it sounds awful, but what are they capable of hearing? If anybody could judge that, who knows? That's a whole nother discussion, but we're taking our own inventory, which is great, but we need to see what's out there and what actually, you know, that's it. What I got. I have too much time. Thank you.
Thanks, Billy. Anybody else? Colette?
I just want to say, apropos of nothing, I love that some people are in the light and some of us are in the dark.
Really international conversation. That's been the theme all day, is just seeing people from all over the world, you know, talking about these very topics. And it is amazing how, you know, Colette, where are you right now?
Me?
Yeah.
Wilmington, Delaware, home of Joe Biden.
No, I'm in New York City. I know there are, I mean, people on the West Coast. Is anyone from out of the country?
New Zealand.
New Zealand.
Oh my gosh.
What is New Zealand's take on our conversation today? I'm so curious.
It's amazing to actually be here and able to participate, because obviously it's otherwise. I have been to the New York Art Book Fair to participate quite a number of times, but it's a huge mission to, you know, fly to New York, two plane rides. So yeah, really, really excited to be here.
You're in the future.
I am. It is. It's Saturday morning. Well, it's midday here. So, and it's at the ending, sort of at the end of our summer.
Oh, amazing. So we are nearing the end of our time together today, but we have one more session like this tomorrow night at 5 o'clock Eastern, or I guess, Layla, for you, it'll be in the afternoon again. And I hope that you all will be able to come back and join us, because we're going to have more conversations similar to this. And I think that they would build really nicely off of the things that we've all been talking about today. You all have access to this Google Doc, and I urge you to, you know, at this point, maybe try not to add new things to the main text, but add comments, because we want to try to preserve, you know, all the work that you guys did today, but I also want you to have it as a resource and to think about it as something that you can continue to have a dialogue with. Any last parting words, Dave and Megan, since you're my co-conspirators on this project?
Just more thanks to everyone for, you know, the really sort of open-minded exploration and sharing of thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for being open to this format and contributing and bringing all your different perspectives to this.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Bye.
Or morning.
Or morning.
Bye, everyone.
Hi all. So great to meet you all. It was really fun.
Thank you. Thanks, Kayla.
Thank you. I'm slightly interested in talking still.
I know. I'm just gonna wait. Does anybody want to stay?
Why not? Yeah.
You can stay.
There's also a happy hour, right? Isn't there?
Oh,
a happy hour?
We have a happy hour at 7.
If we want to just keep on talking.
How have you guys been doing? And how I'm sure it's been amazing.